Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read along podcast. The Wheel of Time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
That is your host, Greg, who somehow still knows very little about the Wheel of Time, even though he usually pretends otherwise.
And that is Tylor, our resident expert, who makes sure you know how much he knows about the Wheel of Time.
It's a lot. Join us each week as we continue our journey through Robert Jordan's great fantasy epic, exploring the books, the television show, ill-advised discussions of visual media on a non-visual podcast, and so much more. Although actually not, it's just that.
Yes, all that and actually nothing else as we travel on, and I know what this means now, through the glass columns.
Yeah, he really doesn't know all that much.
No, you don't know that much. Hello, and welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly read-along Wheel of Time podcast. You know who we are, you know what we do, but we say it each week anyway. Wouldn't it be weird if this was your first episode of a podcast like ours? But anyway, my name is Greg, and I am your host who knows nothing about the Wheel of Time. In fact, I refuse to learn things such as how to correctly pronounce names or who people are. And I am joined by Tylor, who that quality of mine deeply offends. Tylor, how are you?
I'm doing very well. It does not deeply offend me. It just makes me laugh every single time. And I tried to hold it back for you and your well-being mentally, but I don't do very well at holding it back most of the time. We really should turn off these cameras so when I judge you, you feel less bad about it. This felt like a little bit of a turning point this week for me. We had 3 chapters, we covered a lot of ground, and if nothing else, Lord, we finally had something that wasn't Rand. It was wonderful. What did you think of these chapters this week, Greg?
Yeah, I had been wishing that we would move along, and I actually, after our first chapter, I might have the question of how long are we going to be gone? It felt kind of like a real leaving for a time, and that's partially the title, A Departure, doing some of that work. But this was a good week. Still, I will say, I guess a little bit as a criticism, these still feel like they're prefatory, right? Like
Yeah.
I always go back to this. I think I've said this on air before. One time with my dissertation, one of my readers said I was doing a lot of intellectual throat clearing and I need to say something. And I will say that these feel like we're still, we're advancing here, but we're doing a lot of throat clearing, and this is a reminder of where we are and what we're doing. So I'm interested to see if that becomes the norm in these books moving forward as we get deeper into the series. And as you've said before, people, when this one came out, had been really waiting for it by this point, right? It was an established series, and he maybe needed to remind people who'd been waiting the 2 years or the year for it. So, because here we are. We're in my book, we got to just about 200 pages out of just under 900. So, I mean, we're in it. We're pretty far into this book.
Yeah, and I think the thing that's really kind of odd about this series is that when you have such a large kind of overarching plot, something that covers 14 different books, it's really easy. Apologies if you can hear my dog in the background. I think it's really easy to kind of lose the individual book plot. You lose that tree for the forest, right? And so I think that's what Robert Jordan is struggling against here, is he doesn't want book 5 of this series to feel like it has no beginning and no middle and no end. It just kind of is part of everything that came before and after. But in order to do that, I feel like he almost needs to hard reset a few characters, right? Like Egwene is in a very different place than where she was before, and Moiraine is in a different place. And I think all of that is in the service of this book feeling like its own whole as opposed to just a piece of something else. But man, are those first almost 200 pages of every Wheel of Time book so far kind of on the slow side.
Yeah, well, I've alluded to this before. How I just read through the Patrick O'Brien books, and I got grabbed this summer, and someone said like, "Oh, you finished? Like, which one is the best one?" If I wanted to try one, and I was like, because they all kind of just came together, and in my mind, I read one really cool, epic, long story. But to your point, I don't really have like, oh, you should definitely read this one, because I don't really remember, and those ones have kind of quirks like we're seeing here, where there would be two or three that pull together one voyage into a story, but then they'd be on land for the next book or what have you. And so it does feel like, in what you're saying with this kind of hard reset, it's like, yeah, some of these characters have been on an arc and now are seemingly starting a new arc. And for one group of characters that we're reading about today, I'll keep it vague in case people are reading. It feels like they went on a one-book adventure, and now we're going to get their next one-book adventure. Whereas I think the Rand chapters we've experienced so far have felt like more a part of that big Rand story.
And I don't think we need to spend any more time talking about big overarching plots or boats or whatever else goes on in Greg's other series he reads. I think it is time that we summarize Chapter 7, A Departure. So, Egwene is riding her horse for the first time in weeks due to the Aiel disdain about riding horses. She worries that her Aiel clothing is not going to work well on horseback, and she thinks that she found Amis's dream, and she also peeked in on the dreams of many other people who we get kind of updates on throughout the chapter. The first of these are the wise ones, and many of their dreams, it seems like, were tied to Rand. She also tried to look into Rand's dreams and was largely unable to because of the wards that he has wove around his dreams. The Aiel are preparing to leave, and Hadnan Kader, we learn, has dark dreams, and Egwene sees him as she approaches, and she's getting close to the roof of the Maidens, where she sees a woman in black robes. When she looks inside, she sees that it is Isendre, and she is clearly being punished by having robes that will make her be extremely hot in the desert. The Aiel treat Egwene not as a Aes Sedai, but rather as a Wise One pupil, and she thinks to herself that Isendre has violent nightmares, and while she would like to do something about her mistreatment, the maidens have made it clear that they are not going to change what they do, and it is entirely their duty. Rand is, as I noted in my notes, all fancy, and he is talking to a number of traders among the Aiel, who apparently are going to go to the Ogier and ask their stonemasons to help rebuild Rhuidean, and Egwene seems somewhat pleased about this. At this point, Egwene finds Aviendha, who she's been looking for, and Aviendha seems kind of intensely following the conversation and almost offended by what Rand is saying, and Egwene thinks about the fact that she and Aviendha are now near sisters, and that this was kind of secured by exchanging jewelry between Aviendha and Egwene. I found it funny that Egwene wonders about the bracelet that Rand gave her, because earlier in the book, Rand was wondering about the necklace that Egwene gave Aviendha. It's very baffling jewelry. Rand is asked whether or not he intends to return to Rhuidean, and when he doesn't give a complete answer, he then says he will give a gift to Rhuidean, and he channels and starts all of the fountains flowing. Egwene is briefly kind of afraid of a man channeling, but Aviendha is so overwhelmed by the wonder of so much water in the desert. Rand orders all of the people to begin moving, and Egwene starts to worry about Aviendha and thinks that she needs to do something to prevent this kind of obsession and anger that she has with Rand. We then switch into Moraine's point of view, which is very exciting, and she looks at Hadnan Kader thinking that the door frame is now secure and no one else will fall through it. She thinks on all of the Terangriel that have been left behind, and she also thinks about the Aiel tests, the second of which is to go through the glass columns just like men, but the first is to go through rings which let you see past versions of your life, and we are reminded that Moiraine has gone through this test. At this point, Lan comments that she seems worried and afraid, which is a new emotion for her, and he asks if the end is here. She somewhat deflects the question, saying that Tarmon Gaidan is not here, and Rand doesn't press that point, but then says that she is being impatient and asks about her oath to Rand. She says she will do anything short of sharing his bed to guide him, and then she thinks about the fact that the rings told her it would be a very bad idea if she were to share his bed. She apparently even considered this, but then then use that as justification for just how bad things actually are, the fact that she considered that at all. She thinks about how she wishes she remembers more than she does from going through the rings, and Lan says that this process of deferring to Rand will help her humility. Moiraine thinks that Lan is changing, and she thinks that he has a heart where once there was none. Moiraine thinks that she has taken care of Lan and Nynaeve, although he won't know how until after it is done, and then Moiraine takes a jab at Lan's humility, saying that it has been withered, but he says she never lets it rest, and she wishes that she could do more to see what Rand is going to make of the Aiel, but she knows that she won't be able to. I'm much more excited about the second half of this chapter than the first, so say whatever you want about Avienda or whatever, because Moiraine POV, Moiraine POV, Moiraine POV, Greg.
I mean, sure, but also Lan talked. I think it's been like a book and a half since we had some Lan dialogue, so that's what I was excited about there. Clearly a good kind of what ends up feeling like a cap on this long series of chapters from the Aiel Waste. And lots of little detail. I expected your summary to feature many more horse names than it did, because I don't think you mentioned any at all. And I will say I started this chapter being like confused because even though it's capitalized, I missed that, and I thought they were talking about the mist, like there was mist, and then it becomes clear, that Egwene is riding the mist, and I was like, wait, what is happening? And then I pieced it together finally that mist was the name of the horse, which I feel like is some old like 2-minute mystery answer or something like that. Right? That was the name of the horse he rode to town or something. This was an enjoyable chapter though, and not just because it was Moiraine POV, but I do feel like we got a bunch of really nice small things. And I guess I will close by saying my favorite of the small things is the fact that Rand is sending for Ogier to rebuild Meridian. I just loved that detail.
Yeah, and I think it was really fun after having so much of Egwene being frustrated with Rand and Moiraine being frustrated with Rand, to just have a moment where Egwene was almost delighted with the choice that Rand was making. I thought that was kind of a really fun contrast compared to so much of that plot line just being about like the women and Rand not being able to get along and butting heads so much. I agree with you. That was a really fun moment. I want to actually jump back to the beginning of the chapter and talk about the least fun part of this chapter, Hadnan Kader and Isendre. Both of them seem like terrible people. Both of their dreams are haunted and terrible, and Isendre is being punished. I think we need to keep an eye on them because their names just keep coming up over and over again. I guess I'm just checking in. What are your thoughts on these characters before it seems like we leave them behind for a little bit?
Not much, Tyler. Not much. I obviously think what stood out to me the most is just the fact that that's where the wagon train came from, right? It seems like a convenient plot device that's like, I have a ton of things to get to the White Tower. Oh, I'm going to commandeer this wagon train to carry as many as possible. We know that, or that's always a loose phrasing with me, but I'm pretty sure I recall that these were people who were possessed by the Forsaken, but were not actually in control of their actions. So, as I recall, right, Isendre is being punished for things that were out of her control.
Yeah, I don't know whether we know for sure whether it is out of her control or whether it was, something like blackmailed or forced to, right? I don't know whether you would consider that out of your control in like the compulsion sense, but certainly in the sense that they are not good people who are being made to be even worse than they otherwise would be, if that clarifies what you're asking.
Yeah, I think so. And so knowing that they are kind of with this party that is going to be moving some incredibly powerful objects seems worth noting on, right?
Absolutely. We don't need to say any more about them. They bad people. You know who the best people is? It's Matt. And you know what the funniest thing about Matt is? When he gets to observe Moiraine listening to Rand, and just how giddy he was in that discussion made me laugh 2 or 3 times. It was a really fun moment. That and Egwene describing just how excited he seemed to be leaving. I felt like we only got maybe 2 paragraphs of Matt, but it was a really fun couple paragraphs. Did you have any notes on that character? Or I thought it was kind of interesting to see Egwene almost taking Moraine's side as opposed to the boys' side for the first time, when she seems kind of offended by how excited Matt is that Moiraine is taking orders.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's this kind of misogyny on it, right? Like there's this like, hey, let's humble the uppity woman type attitude, which I don't like, but it is kind of delicious that Matt thinks that's what this is, right? The humor is in the misreading of it instead of at the expense of Moiraine. It's more at the expense of Matt. And it's I'm anticipating that this group is going to be torn asunder pretty soon. That I'm not sure the exact fragments, but that we're not going to have all of these people traveling together anymore. So I think it's important that we're getting these shots between all the different parties as we kind of might be, shaking up shaking up the boggle cube in order to see what letters fall together this time.
Yes, I think that's absolutely correct. I also just, while we're on the subject of Matt, just want to note Egwene calling out the fact that Melindra is apparently much older than Matt brings back one of my favorite jokes from the television show, where Matt flirts with someone his own age and Rand asks, "Isn't she a little young for you?" The fact that Matt is once again with a middle-aged woman is just great characterization by Robert Jordan. Bravo. If we're going to jump from Matt, who is the definition of lately and hilariously misogynist, I want to jump to a bond that I don't know whether had really been addressed prior to this book, but it's gotten 3 call-outs already in this one. We are meant to believe that Egwene and Aviendha are extremely close, to the point that they are exchanging jewelry similarly in similar kind of ritual to the way that people who are, going to be engaged in Aiel culture would exchange jewelry. So this felt kind of meaningful, and especially given that Rand was kind of jealous of whoever gave Aviendha jewelry earlier in the book, this feels like a mini mystery resolved. What are your thoughts on this kind of budding friendship between these 2 characters, who honestly I don't know if they were on the same page prior to this book?
Well, as I learned in my undergraduate days, you go on one naked run with somebody and you're bonded for life. You've seen it all. That is not the kind of college I went to as an undergraduate. The gap between that kind of Animal House version of college and my college is hilarious in my mind, if not to the listeners. It actually is kind of similar to what I just said. If we're kind of shaking up these characters a little bit, to have that shift and have that bond, I think is interesting in that, so much has been made of kind of Aviendha, Elayne, Rand as a triangle, and Egwene's been really pushed out of that ranking, as we've talked about already this season, but this kind of keeps her in the mix with those characters, not as a potential love interest, but as somebody who still figures prominently into the lives of all 3 of those people, right? We're not going to pass the Bechdel test with this, but the fact that she kind of has platonic bonds with all of them matters. It's curious in the context of the television show because they made the Egwene-Rand relationship so much more of a relationship that it'll be interesting to see how they handle this.
Yeah, I'm really interested in just how kind of tightly interwoven the characters in that particular grouping are, right? It feels like kind of Perrin and Fael are very separate from the rest of the group, and even Matt is very much, he's with this cluster, but he feels like he kind of has his own independent kind of plot lines, whereas it feels like Rand and Egwene and Moiraine and Aviendha, none of them are doing anything that doesn't impact the others anymore, and so as you say, that can't kind of be the permanent outcome here. So how does that kind of ball of yarn get unspooled, that I think is a really interesting question to be asking going forward. I think you're identifying how tight that cluster is getting, and so when it breaks, it's going to have to break in a really interesting way.
And if I learned anything as an undergraduate, tough clusters are hard to break. Again, I did not go to that kind of college. Go ahead.
I don't know what that would mean, but it had the cadence of a joke, as one of my favorite random lines goes. If we had not already seen Rand pouring sand or water on sand, as was prophesied, I'm pretty sure starting these fountains is the definition of pouring water on sand. The only thing about this kind of end of the Egwene section that stood out to me is just the pure sense of wonder that Aviendha has, and Aviendha almost seems to forget her problems while Egwene is still dwelling on them, and I think that tells you something about just how meaningful this was to the Aiel. Other than just being a cool and pretty image, any thoughts on Rand restoring the flow of water to the desert?
Well, I was thinking about Civilization and how all the fantasy franchises get like terrible app versions of the game Civilization, right? There's a Lord of the Rings one, there's a Game of Thrones, Build Your Kingdom. They're all essentially Clash of Kingdoms, but scaled into that. I was like, oh, here's the Wheel of Time one, right? Like you get to build Ruidian while, because it's always like the named characters passing it off to some unidentified heretofore character who can do the work. So that would be me, the app builder, and I would spend my crystals to increase the number and like size of the fountains, and I would play it 200 hours that I would never regret.
I would play the hell out of that game. I just need to be clear. Amazon, you have a gaming division. Make Wheel of Time games. It doesn't matter what type they are. I will give you money. I am your whale. Please do it. I want to divide the discussion of the second half of this chapter into two sections. We got to talk about Moiraine and we got to talk about Lan. I don't think we can talk about Lan without talking about Moiraine first. So, boy oh boy, is this a section of the book that I can't say much about because Moiraine is thinking about her memories of things that will happen, and that is weird and intentionally vague by Robert Jordan. And please say words so I don't trip up and spoil lots of things.
Yeah, so we've talked before that Moiraine is giving off vibes, and I think before we've said Gandalf vibes. I'm going to go to Book 6 Dumbledore vibes, right? So this would be when Dumbledore realizes that he is probably not going to make it out of that book. Am I worried about spoiling these books at this point? I don't know. And so he spends the whole book training Harry to survive without him. And there are quite a few lines in this chapter that makes it clear Moiraine is not going to be present with Rand much longer. And so as a first-time reader, and I guess this means I'm the only one who gets to comment, I'm wondering, I left this chapter going like, well, is she about to die? Are they just about to both get separated? There's a lot she says about how she had to make this oath. Her justification of the oath is like she has to be close now to kind of, it sounds like, work down a checklist before the separation comes. And again, this chapter title of A Departure, right? Is that what it was?
Yeah.
A Departure. Kind of puts this mood on it like, yes, they are all departing Ruidian, but it feels like there is a stronger departure in the coming days, weeks, months, and time is slipping away from Moiraine, and she has a lot to do before that. And then you just gave us the important reminder that she has seen it, right? She knows this. And the reminder in the chapter about the rings and the potential futures, I think all of that works to remind us that this isn't just a slight feeling, but she knows what is going to happen to some degree. Though she is very clear with Lan, it is not yet Tar Gaimon. So, how'd I do?
Tarman Gaidan, which is actually what was on a shirt that I wore to the Roots concert yesterday. I forgot to change and was full nerd at that show. It was a really good time, mostly because I was full nerd. I thought the moment that really sold this was Moiraine thinking, she had this kind of odd circular thought of, the rings told me I could not sleep with Rand, I never would have considered sleeping with Rand. Imagine how desperate this must have been in order for me to possibly consider sleeping with Rand. Therefore, this is horrible and bad enough that maybe I should sleep with Rand. That is, I think, a sign of how much this character who is always in control is kind of careening off center. And that's worrisome, given, as you said, it's happening because of a prophecy or a vision that we are not in on at this point. Last thoughts on Moiraine, or your favorite missing character for a book and a half. What did you think about Lan finally getting to say words?
I mean, he doesn't get much, but I thought in a very small section, and I do want to mention both in this regard, they reestablished their chemistry pretty well. This kind of, and I think this comes through really well, especially if you know the TV show, where it's like, Lan's just going to kind of follow along, but gets to comment on it, right? He's not just an obedient servant, but he gets to kind of weigh in and put in his kind of commentary on whether he thinks she's making good choices or not. And so, again, if the Boggle Box is being shaken, I think these two are probably ending up together, but it's nice to get that refresher on what their dynamic is. And just nice to see Lan again, like I said.
Yeah, and I really liked when Moiraine is kind of summing up both how this is the same as how things have been before, and also how Lan has substantially changed. And there's a moment in here that really stood out to me where Moiraine thinks that she has taken care of Lan and Nynaeve, and then she thinks, although he won't know it until after it is done. And that idea that Moiraine kind of clearly has a plan for what is going to happen with Lan after whatever we are alluding to in all of her foreshadowing, that is kind of a blinking light for me now. I'm wondering, okay, what is Lan's role in this once whatever shakeup that is now being predicted actually occurs?
Bogglebox, not shakeup.
Bogglebox? Okay, I apologize for not saying it correctly. Any last thoughts on where you think this Bogglebox is going to end up before we move on to a completely different Bogglebox in Chapter 8?
Only that I give credit to Robert Jordan from all these POVs. He is not tipping his hand at all, reminding us that they are sending a wagon train full of incredibly powerful objects to an unsecure place at this point. If that prologue wasn't there to remind you that the White Tower has fallen, in a sense, you would not know it. And that's very good of him, because it would be very easy to put in kind of some winky naughty stuff that was naughty as in shaking your head, not naughty as in the other kind, but it would be very easy to kind of overplay that, and I thought he's played that very well, and he does so again in the next chapter, which I would be delighted if you would tell us about.
I will do so immediately after making a joke about how George R.R. Martin writes books that are both more naughty and more naughty than Robert Jordan. Chapter 8, Over the Border. Nynaeve holds onto a bouncing wagon, thinking about the drought that has clearly beset the area around her. She apparently recently summoned a dust storm after they were being accosted by a number of brigands, and she and Elayne were both surprised by the intensity of the storm, and she thinks that it is lucky they are not being followed because she is no longer angry enough to channel. She kind of awkwardly hangs off of the wagon, getting a drink, and when she gets back, she sees that Elayne is now cuddled up against Tom and kind of talking to him in an overly familiar manner. Nynaeve thinks that now that they are out of danger, they need to slow down, and starts giving orders to Tom and others, including ordering Elayne to put on a hat because the sun is bright, and then she seems both surprised and indignant when Elayne doesn't respond. Elayne compliments Tom's driving, and then Tom immediately spots that there are a number of children of the light ahead. Nynaeve begins to get nervous because she is wearing her accepted ring around her neck along with Lan's ring, but as they get closer, they they realize that the group is not, or doesn't seem to be bothering them at all, and so they decide to go the discreet route rather than trying to run. Nynaeve greets the White Cloaks and explains that they recently ran into issues with brigands, but instead the White Cloaks ask whether they are traitors, where they are bound, and whether or not there are any issues in other parts of the world. They claim they are taking dyes to Andor, and when the White Cloaks try to inspect their goods, they give an excuse about why their items would be destroyed if they try to do any sort of inspection. The White Cloak asks after what is going on in Tanchico, and they tell the truth, although quite vaguely, and they confirm that both Andric and Amathera are on the throne. They say that they have not experienced any Aes Sedai when the White Cloaks ask, and when Elayne asks whether they are close to the border, they are told they are 5 miles from the border, and when Elayne follows up asking if they intend to move the border, that seems to get the White Cloaks a bit more interested and causes Nynaeve to be upset at her and causes her to dismiss Elayne kind of in an insulting way. The White Cloaks say that they are sending food to limit the number of refugees, and then Tom has them ride away relatively quickly while Nynaeve begins berating Elayne for questioning the White Cloaks. Elayne asks why Nynaeve was so obedient, but Tom yells at both of them for fighting, potentially drawing the attention of the White Cloaks. Elayne then snuggles Tom and apologizes, and Nynaeve says that they should resupply in the nearest village and then continue on, but everyone else objects, saying that they should stay at a town in the inn. She says that the one-wagon traders wouldn't be able to afford an inn, and then she thinks of a number of the mistakes she's made along the way, although she thinks she will never admit to them, and then agrees that they will camp nearby, although they will not stay in an inn. Hey, Greg, this chapter didn't have Rand in it. That was what was exciting to me. What did you think otherwise?
It was exciting, and there's a really funny episode of Community where the gang in Community is putting on a Christmas pageant, and then Britta appears, and the dean looks at his program and says, "Oh, Britta's in this?" And I use that line a lot. Basically, whenever that actress, Gillian Jacobs, shows up in something, I just turn to my wife and go, "Oh, Britta's in this?" And that happens a lot, and I won't say where but people know. People watching current television know she's popped up by surprise a few places lately. So I had a moment where I was like, oh, Nynaeve's in this? Because, I think I said repeatedly last book that this is not my favorite of the last Bogglebox shakeup. So I was like, oh, I really wanted to go to the Two Rivers, but it's okay. We will have time. There's 900 pages in this book. So go ahead.
I was waiting to tell you this until you brought it up, but I think we are now late enough in the book for me to let you know this. We're not going to go back to the Two Rivers. This book is Perrin and Fael's honeymoon.
Well, that's it. Find yourself a new host next time through the glass columns.
Man, I got so
I was
many
pausing
hosts
long
lined
enough.
up.
Anyway, I did in this chapter end up enjoying being back with these characters. My main takeaway is it felt like Robert Jordan was saying, I've been on your internet message boards. I see you guessing that Tom is Elayne's father. I will shout that down so hard by having them flirt and cuddle that you do not want it to be true anymore.
Yeah, I think when I was like 14 or 15, when this book, I was finally reading it when I was old enough to understand the romance plot, I was like, oh, I'm really, really glad that I did not follow through on that firm belief that they were related. I think you're absolutely right. This is a chapter that resets Nynaeve and Elayne's relationship. It resets Elayne and Tom's relationship. And otherwise, it reminds us that the White Cloaks exist and are dangerous. That's the whole chapter as far as I'm concerned. I literally had 2 things to say, and we've already covered one of them. Did you have any thoughts here? I really think that the next chapter is the one that lets us dig into these characters in an interesting way.
2.
Okay.
I think I hit on Elayne, Tom. This new closeness is weird. Actually, and sorry, one of mine I want to save for the next chapter because I don't want to give something away. But really, it seemed like the point here was just to make it clear that they were able to escape and how far they've gotten as a part of this. I found myself going to the map at the front of the book. So I just want to invite our listeners, if they have not, remember, and this is me filling you in on what I had forgotten, remember that Tanchico was very far to the west, farther than maybe I had recalled. And so we have this kind of large horn of the continent that is labeled as Terabon. So their decision to kind of grab a wagon and go that way, and as they all kept saying in this chapter, like, yeah, we'll just cut across real quick. We'll be there in no time. And the narrator gets to say, actually, they won't. It's actually going to be a little harder than they imagine. But then the only other takeaway I took, other than like, here's how they safely got away, is just it's another region where there is political chaos and instability, and get ready for more of that, because that's what's happening. The whole continent is a powder keg.
Yeah, that was my other note, is I just wanted to kind of take a minute and point out all of the little bit of politicking we're getting here and make sure that we're kind of following all of the details. So the big things here, one, Tanchico seems to at least be remaining in the status quo. The king is still the king, and interesting from our perspective, Amathera is still the panarch, given that she was working in the kitchen the last time that Elayne and Nynaeve were interacting with her. It's good to know that she is back on the throne. The other thing that we are getting here is an interesting update. Both Tom and Elayne seem a little bit baffled by what Pedron Niall is doing, because he is at the moment trying to keep Ilion from taking territory from two neighboring territories. As you were noting, we are in Amadicia, but also Gaelden just to the north of it, and Altara are all potentially close enough to Ilion for it to gobble up along the edges, and both Tom and Elayne are kind of surprised that Pedron Niall would be paying attention to the west side of his dominion, given that on the east side, that is where Ilion is causing all of the problems. So no real notes there, but if we're looking at the map, those are kind of the intrigues we should be paying attention to, possibly for future books.
Interesting indeed. I liked the kind of tiny bit of intrigue about, oh, you show us which barrels you want opened, and like kind of the playing with that stuff. And so we know, they're a little bit more on top of their game than we might have guessed. But that is really it. That is all I have there.
Yeah, that feels like the kind of scene that is 2 lines of dialogue in this book and could be 5 minutes of the beginning of Inglourious Bastards non-stop, like heart-racing moment in the television show, but it accomplishes what it needs to here. It was a fun moment to read. Chapter 9, A Signal. Nynaeve grudgingly admits that the men chose a good campsite, and she thinks about the many items in the camp, including the Ter Angriel that they recovered from the Black Aja and the seal of the Dark One's prison. The men are sent away with money and told that they should not buy only meat. Soon after, they return with only meat. Nynaeve thinks that the world has changed, or she has, since she arrived at the White Tower. She thinks about how she used to be convinced she was only there to save the boys and also to catch up with Moiraine, but now she realizes that she means to heal, and she thinks about the fact that she both wants to heal Tom's leg and the wound on Rand's side someday, and she thinks she will be able to do it because anything should be able to be healed by the power. At this point, they start talking about what happened in Tanchico, and they use a code to make it clear that I can't think of his name, the thief catcher, Julin, to make sure that he doesn't overhear them talking about Mogadien. They think about the rumors of a number of different countries, and while they are talking about this, Julin comments on how Amathera is pretty, which I just found to be a really funny non sequitur. Nynaeve hasn't told the men about the Forsaken that might be after them, and so they're kind of delicately balancing, letting them know how dangerous things are without letting them know exactly what the danger is. They also talk about what they are trying to do in terms of not being caught, and Nynaeve thinks they took the least likely route, but Nynaeve is still nervous because she knows there is basically nothing they can do if Mogadien does catch up with them. Elayne says that Nynaeve is just nervous and they don't need to change anything that they're doing, but it's very clear that everything is kind of feeling under pressure for them, and they both know that they are feeling watched in their dreams, which they take as a sign that Moghedien may know where they are, but we know that may possibly be Egwene watching their dreams. Tom returns to camp, reporting that the town is withering without trade from Tanchico, and Tom also, at this point, he comments again on how Pedro Nial's plans really don't make sense at all as he now gets more details. Nynaeve and Elayne then say that they are going to go for a walk into town and buy some more vegetables, which worries the men, but Nynaeve is able to convince them that they don't need anyone to guard them. As soon as they are away from the camp, Nynaeve starts questioning Elayne about her relationship with Tom. Nynaeve says that he is old enough to be her father, and Elayne angrily insists that he is not her father. Nynaeve then says that she thought that she loved Rand, and Elayne says that he is far away, but when Nynaeve says that Aviendha is looking after him, Elayne says that she should have let Rand know that she loves him. Nynaeve thinks that I love you usually sends men running, and Elayne mentions that that Min had mentioned sharing Rand, and she says that she thinks it was serious and not a joke. Nynaeve calls that ridiculous, but then realizes internally that she shares Lan with Moiraine. Nynaeve then begins asking if that's what's going on with Elayne and Tom, and Elayne says that Rand is likely looking at other women, so she has a right to do the same. When Nynaeve warns her that Tom is more than he seems, Elayne says that he is a great man who would have been greater if not for love. Elayne is clearly frustrated both with herself and with Nynaeve, but doesn't know what else to do, and even though she kind of acknowledges that she may be acting somewhat childish, she kind of is devoted to doing what she feels is in the best interest, even as Nynaeve thinks that she doesn't know what is in her best interest. And it turns out they really are going to town to buy vegetables, much to Elayne's surprise. They walk into town, talking somewhat pleasantly, and Nynaeve thinks on how she will have to address Elayne and Tom even further down the road, and they are pointedly ignoring all of the white cloaks in town, and she sees that the town is fairly picked over, thinking Tom may actually not have been able to find any vegetables. Eventually, she sees some flowers in a shop window and stops. She recognizes the flowers as a yellow Aja symbol, and she was told the secret by a sister who was certain that she was going to become a yellow Aja. They enter the shop and they are greeted by Rande Makura, who introduces herself, and when Nynaeve gives a signal, the woman immediately sends someone to begin brewing tea and is kind of evasive when Nynaeve insists on the message immediately, but eventually Rande leads her into the back of the building and they are served tea. They talk for a bit, and as they are drinking, the message is given that all sisters are welcome to return. The tower must be whole and strong. Nynaeve doesn't understand what is going on, but then she realizes that something is going on with Elayne and then herself, and soon realizes that the tea has been drugged, and she passes out. I feel like this chapter should be much more exciting given the ending that I just gave it, but most of it is about buying vegetables and flirting with old men. What did you make of the flirting with old men chapter, Greg?
I was going to say my two favorite hobbies. So the ending of this reminded me of there's a really clunky moment, surprise, surprise, in Revenge of the Sith, the third Star Wars prequel, where Obi-Wan and Anakin are running down a hall and they suddenly are inside some kind of new shield we've never heard of before. And Obi-Wan turns to Anakin and is like, how did we fall for this? We're smarter than this. And it really felt to me at the end of this like, come on. Like, you know that the Aja are all invaded by the Black Aja and you are actively hunting traitors. You should know these signals are not safe and have been corrupted in some way. It seemed ridiculous. So that was my frustration with the chapter, certainly, even though that's the very end.
I think the really fun thing, though, is that the girls should have been aware that the Black Aja were after them. They should have been aware that Moghedien is after them. They should have been cautious. And yet, what were they beaten by? It turns out, according to the message, probably actually Elayne, who has no idea where they are or what she's doing. It's kind of the irony of they should have known better, and they actually didn't know about the one plot that ended up mattering in terms of how they were kind of impacted by it. I agree with you. This is a chapter that just makes me just facepalm the entire time. I'm like, Elayne, what are you doing? Tom, what are you doing? Nynaeve, how? The entire chapter. That being said, the chapter starts with Nynaeve being remarkably mature. The moment where she thinks through what her original goals were at the White Tower and what her current goals are, and she kind of makes peace with the fact that she is a different person than who she once was. And given that this is a character whose POVs mostly consist of her berating other characters and then admitting internally that she was wrong, it's really kind of wonderful to see her maturely evaluate something and realize how much she's changed instead of insisting that everyone else is wrong and she's the same she's always been.
Yes, and I'm going to couple that onto the point I wanted to make last chapter, which is I think there's a danger in the way Elayne has been positioned to make Elayne feel very unserious, that she's just kind of doting on Rand and is like, well, if I can't be with the one that I love, I'll be with the one I'm with. And so this kind of whole thing with Tom is weird and childish. But there are these moments where Nynaeve pauses and gives like an appreciative shout out to something Elayne has done, right? Something Elayne has said or a choice Elayne made. And those, I think, help ground that character in an actually kind of important way, while also speaking to the maturity of Nynaeve, that Nynaeve can kind of evaluate her and say, oh, actually, like, you know, that's silly of her, but this is where I actually see the kind of the steel beneath the outer appearance.
And I think that's the interesting thing about Nynaeve and Elayne being in the same plot line, is that Nynaeve is so good at that kind of like intuitive, thoughtful gut instinct thing, but she is so wrapped up in her own kind of thinking that she often just won't go with it because she doesn't want to be seen in a particular way. Elayne, on the other hand, is like thoughtful and really kind of deliberate in a way that she's been trained to be as a future queen, but she just does not have any of that kind of like street smarts, good instincts that Nynaeve relies on in really important moments. And so seeing them kind of clash heads is always really fun because they're so different and they often are both kind of right in different ways. And I think that's what we're seeing here, although Elayne is not at all right about flirting with Tom. I need to be clear about this. As a human being who was a professor for a decade, no, young ladies, the old man is not interested. Go away.
Man, I don't want to touch that joke just because I still am a professor. The piece I will pick up on there, as well as Nynaeve does remind us here that she was once a very young woman thrown into leadership, right, as the wisdom. And we get this reminder that she was a young wisdom and that she was able to do the job well. I took that as kind of a hint that that's why she knows Elayne will be okay. And it is just worth reminding I think our listeners know, but like there's a nice kind of, oh, she's a young woman coming into her own, but there's also a she's gonna be queen valence to these moments too. That like, oh my gosh, like this is not just any young woman coming into the world. This is actually going to be a very important political figure.
I'll be honest, the clunkiest part of this chapter to me immediately follows that, and it's like 2.5 pages of Nynaeve just thinking how scary it is that Moghedien is chasing them. Like, there's nothing wrong with that. It needed to be in there, but I didn't need 8 different reminders of how afraid Nynaeve is. It's a Forsaken. That's scary. We'll have another conflict with her at some point. That's all I kind of needed here. What did you think about that section of the chapter?
I would agree and just add, like, I think there's, for that, and I think somewhere else in this chapter, there's somebody saying like, oh, those are actual things, not just like myths, right? And so there's this idea that all of these figures, all of these creatures have existed in myth and nightmare for so long, and now they're everyday occurrences. So a reminder, I think it might have been Julian, that like, oh, like this is all real now, and we need to be aware that everybody's going to be affected by it.
Absolutely. We don't need to spend a lot of time talking about Nynaeve and Elayne arguing about Tom, but there were 2 moments in that discussion that really stood out to me. Number one, the moment when Elayne kind of angrily says that Tom is not her father really rang emotionally true to me. I felt like that really worked. And then on the flip side, Nynaeve's assertion that every time that the woman tells a man, I love you first, the man runs away, was just funny to me. Like, I know Robert Jordan knows that is not accurate, but it's hilarious that Nynaeve thinks that.
Yeah, I mean, both of those to me are like reminders that these characters are still nicely drawn and their relationship is nicely drawn. I think these two chapters feel like a check-in after like they experienced a pretty traumatizing event last book.
Yeah.
And just to show us that they are the same but not the same, I think is important, and those little character moments help demonstrate that.
Absolutely. And then my favorite moment in this entire chapter, Nynaeve realizing that she thinks it is offensive, the idea that Rand would share himself with multiple women, and then immediately realizing that Lan is extremely dedicated to both herself and Moiraine in almost the same way. That was just a really nice moment of symmetry given what we were talking about a couple of chapters ago, and I thought I was really glad that this chapter and Chapter 7 came together to get the Lan-Nynaeve dynamic from both sides. I think really worked.
Yeah, and it does also kind of fit together with what we were talking about last chapter about how, like, Egwene being kind of alongside these romantic pairings but not romantic. It is kind of like that's now the situation we have here where, you know, there is a very strong bond between Lan and Moiraine, and we're to take that as not at all romantic. So there we go. Parallels.
I need to point out the fact that when we go to a medieval city and they are lacking any food, that is what happens if you don't have capitalism, and inflation can't happen. So be happy with the way the economy is looking now. At least you can eat. Greg, do you have anything to say about the economy of the Wheel of Time?
I was gonna say, look at that, another joke I don't want to touch in our modern political climate. No, I mean, I think, you know, I do think that we are often forgetting the cost all of this has on the common people. We've talked before about how that's something George R.R. Martin makes a bigger deal of, that, like, yeah, these armies like shred each other, and there's like a farmer who was trying to make a living on that plot of land. And so here we have the instability is just affecting everybody, even if we don't really like see that suffering that often.
The only other thing I have in this chapter, we've kind of already talked a little bit about how silly it was that the girls fell for this trap. But I did like the idea that Nynaeve is so obviously going to be a healer that the Yellow Aja just started giving her their secrets well before she became an Aes Sedai. Like, that's kind of the moment that rings true in there, that Nynaeve is almost so proud she knows the signal, she doesn't think about why it's being put up or what kind of other than the obvious could be creating this. She kind of almost ignores the trap because she's so happy she knew the sign that it turns out was a trap.
It's a funny little moment because it's like good spycraft, right? Like, this would be the kind of thing, you know, Cold War spy would have done. And there's a way in which Wheel of Time has insulated itself from criticism like that. You know, something like Star Wars gets criticized when a certain word comes through because you're like, really, would they say that word in that far off galaxy? But in this case, it's like, well, but maybe there's actually a connection back to Cold War America in some way and so on. But, you know, other than my frustration that they fell for it, and, you know, again, I think there's a way in which it's excusable. I'm not saying this is like a great offense, but like, it's all well done. Like, the idea that they would have signals and the idea she would see it and get excited, it's all well done. And I think it's fair to read it as a momentary lack in judgment that seems silly but would happen.
Yeah, I think that these girls are 18, and so it makes sense that they are going to make a mistake when the pretty flowers get them excited. That sounded much more sexist than I intended it. I promise that was an 18-year-old thing, not a girl thing. Any last thoughts on this chapter before I apologize to the Me Too movement for 10 minutes and then say the name of our podcast?
I was going to say, no, I'm going to keep quiet and let you get canceled. No, I mean, so again, it is nice to be with different characters. It's nice to see where this plot line is going. I did feel like the start of last book for this group of characters, it was like in a great video game, you get those, you meet the two patrons at the tavern and they offer you a couple opportunities. We took care of one and now we're getting to see potentially the other one happen. As well as that sense of dread, because there are a couple lines here where it's like, let's just get back to the tower. It'll all be good if we can check in with the Amerlin seed and move along. Hand over these objects and move along. I guess we didn't include that in your summary. And it's just delicious dramatic irony, as we've said. It's really nicely done and keeps me anxious and wanting to read more for that reason. Tyler, what should I read when I read more?
Yeah, you can read more. And guess what, y'all? Even more. It's 3 chapters next week rather than 2. That is Chapter 10, Figs and Mice, Chapter 11, The 9-Horse Hitch, and Chapter 12, An Old Pipe. All of those sound like the kind of thing that I would name an inn in a Dungeons & Dragons game. Any thoughts about what you're expecting next week? And then, just get us out of this podcast.
Definitely a 9-horse hitch. I immediately said that's a tavern. It's got to be a tavern. That was where my head went. No, I'm excited to continue on. Like I said, we are somehow already 200 pages into this. We do these recordings and things change with Tyler and I personally, but we've been doing these kind of weekly instead of cramming more in or slowing down or what have you. And I still think of this as, this is the new book. We just barely started. And it's like, no, we're pretty deep already into this season, though he has disappointed me by letting me know we won't finish till 2025. Alas. We'll still continue on that journey next time through the glass columns.
So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor Orm and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, Amazon, or our wives. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, find us on Instagram or Threads by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being a part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe, leave us a review wherever you are listening, and recommend this show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time on Through the Glass Columns.